In the late 90s, Friday night had an owner, Blockbuster. The blue and yellow brand became a cultural ritual, and if you are in your 30s, you definitely remember the feeling of choosing a movie by its cover, fighting for the last copy, or walking out with your weekend plans right in your hand. At its peak, the company operated around 9,000 stores and moved something close to $6 billion a year. It seemed invincible, but the fall was fast and humiliating. How did an empire of that size lose to a competitor that, in the beginning, was just a website mailing DVDs? The answer isn't just the internet. It is a mix of short-sighted decisions, a profit model the company got addicted to, heavy debt, and a meeting in Texas that became a legend regarding decisions entrepreneurs regret the most. Today, we are going to rewind this tape and understand how Blockbuster went from owning the weekend to becoming a memory. But first, subscribe to the channel to help me out, hit the like button, and if you are new here, welcome to Money and Magnates. A lot of people imagine Blockbuster was born out of a passion for cinema. Actually, it was born from something much colder: data. The man who opened the first Blockbuster in 1985 was David Cook, a guy from the tech world who had powerful database software and needed a real-world case to prove its value. Back then, video rental stores were small neighborhood businesses with limited catalogs and inevitable chaos. Tapes went missing, customers swore they returned them, someone wrote it down wrong on paper, and it turned into an argument at the counter. Cook looked at that and saw inefficiency, and he saw opportunity. The first store in Dallas had a differentiator that felt like the future: barcode tracking and a massive inventory by the standards of the time. While most neighborhood spots had a few hundred tapes, Blockbuster was already operating with about 8,000 titles. This wasn't just more options, it was an experience. You walked in and felt there was a movie for every mood and every type of audience. And when a consumer finds comfort, they come back. The concept worked fast, but growing at the pace Cook wanted required heavy capital, scale, and a franchise mindset. That is where a decisive name enters the picture: Wayne Huizenga. He was already known for building businesses at scale with franchise logic and a focus on cash flow. Huizenga saw Blockbuster not as cinema, but as a replicable system: a standardized product, a predictable consumption routine, and an average ticket size that was easy to estimate. The strategy was almost military: buy smaller rental stores, swap the sign for a Blockbuster one, impose standard layouts, inventory, and service, and repeat. The brand spread with absurd speed. In 1994, Blockbuster was so big it was bought by Viacom for about $8.4 billion. The message was clear: this isn't a fad. This is the center of home entertainment. And for a few years, Blockbuster really seemed to have won the culture war. In many cities, there was no competitor in its league. What they were selling wasn't just a movie. It was convenience, routine, and habit. But the model had a hidden heart, and it was toxic. Because here is the part many people don't realize: Blockbuster discovered it made more money when the customer messed up than when the customer got it right. The famous late fees became a gigantic revenue engine. Estimates cited in analyses of the company place these fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year, with records suggesting something close to $800 million in certain periods of the early 2000s. In other words, a very relevant chunk of the money came from the most common human error in the world: forgetting. And the worst part is that this hit the customer directly in their emotions. The fine wasn't just money. It was the feeling of, "I've been tricked." Many people remember the moment they realized the cheap rental was bait, and the fine could double or triple the bill if you were late. The company tried to soften the blow with promotions and loyalty cards, but the memory that stuck was the punishment. This detail matters because it explains why Netflix gained so much sympathy early on. The difference wasn't just technology, it was a psychological pact. You won't be punished for being late. That creates loyalty, but that choice charges an invisible price. It turns into resentment. Constant fines might fatten the cash register, but they erode trust. And when a competitor shows up offering the exact pain you cause as their advantage, they don't need to invent the market. They just need to open the door. It is there that Netflix enters as a simple and dangerous antidote. By the year 2000, Blockbuster's fate was already being written behind the scenes. Netflix was a small startup, still bleeding money, trying to sustain a bold model, mailing DVDs with a monthly subscription and no late fees. For the customer, it was liberating. You built a list, received an envelope at home, watched on your own time, and returned it when you wanted, without that ticking clock feeling. For the company, it was expensive. Logistics, postage, inventory control, and in the beginning, a market that was still learning to trust buying on the internet. Even so, the founders, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph, believed this was the future, and since Netflix was too small to go toe-to-toe with a brick-and-mortar giant, they looked for a logical exit, a partnership or buyout. They flew to Dallas for a meeting with Blockbuster, led by CEO John Antioco. The proposal was straightforward. Blockbuster would buy Netflix for $50 million, and Netflix would become the company's online arm. Blockbuster would keep the stores. Netflix would bring the future. On paper, it looked like a perfect marriage. The problem was that the meeting room was stuck in the present. Netflix seemed too small, too weird, and the mail seemed too slow to compete with driving to the store. There are accounts of this meeting saying the executives didn't take the offer seriously. Looking back with today's eyes, that is where the tragedy lies. It wasn't that they didn't have the money to buy them. They had it, and plenty of it. What was missing was respect for what was being born. They lacked the humility to understand that the future, when it arrives, almost always looks like a joke. They ignored the very ideal that took Blockbuster to its peak. They ignored innovation. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph left without a deal. And on the other side, Netflix returned with a cruel clarity. If Blockbuster wasn't going to buy them, they had to be fought. Netflix did two things that together seem simple but are powerful. First, they fine-tuned the experience. Faster delivery, smarter catalog, more predictable service. Second, they started treating recommendation as a product, a system that learns your taste, suggests the next movie, and reduces friction. Instead of searching for a movie, you started receiving the right movie. Meanwhile, Blockbuster kept doing what it always did, expanding stores, selling the physical experience, betting on the strength of the logo, and keeping the late fee machine spinning. And here enters a point that changes how we understand the story. Blockbuster didn't fall just because Netflix was better. It fell because when it realized the danger, it was already financially handcuffed. While Netflix was learning to operate as a service, Blockbuster was still trapped in a heavy model. Think about the hidden cost of keeping a giant rental store running. Prime location rent, constant renovations, shift staff, security, systems, maintenance, local inventory, and losses. And in the early 2000s, another shift happened. VHS gave way to DVD. For the consumer, it was wonderful. For a chain with thousands of stores, it meant renewing the catalog, adjusting distribution contracts, changing processes, and dealing with media that got cheaper much faster. The problem wasn't just keeping up with technology, it was sustaining the transition with one foot stuck in physical operations. And there was still a mindset problem. For a company that grew by selling the trip to the store, it was hard to accept that the future would be not needing to go. The heart of the business was the physical building. Letting go of that seemed like admitting the empire had an expiration date. In 2004, Viacom spun off Blockbuster, and the company began operating separately. But it came out of this process carrying massive debt, around $1 billion. To make matters worse, part of this burden came in the form of a large financing deal. Analyses of the company cite a loan around $1.1 billion due in 2006, which put constant pressure on generating cash to roll over the debt. In practice, they gained independence, but started the game already exhausted, with interest to pay and less margin for error. And innovating in the real world isn't romantic. It costs money, hurts the quarterly report, and scares investors. Even so, John Antioco tried to react with moves that, on paper, made sense. The first was attacking the biggest reason for customer hatred, the fines. The company launched the No Late Fees campaign, announced in late 2004 and implemented in 2005. This seemed like a turnaround. The punishment is over. Now it's convenience. The problem is that the execution became controversial. To many consumers, it sounded like they changed the name, but the charge remained. There were lawsuits and settlements with states in the U.S. because the communication wasn't clear about when the charge turned into a restocking fee and at what point the rental converted into a purchase. Even those who didn't follow the lawsuits felt the practical effect. Trust, already fragile because of the fines, became even harder to rebuild. In many cases, it wasn't exactly no fines. If the customer didn't return it in a few days, the charge appeared in another form, and that became ammo for anyone wanting to ditch the brand. Then came the more aggressive reaction. introduction: Blockbuster Total Access. The idea this time was smart and leveraged the biggest advantage Blockbuster still had: physical presence. With Total Access, you subscribed online, received DVDs, and could return them at a physical store, and walk out with another one in your hand right then. This eliminated the dead time of the mail, and for a period, the plan worked. Analyses show Blockbuster reached millions of subscribers with this model. Only the bill was cruel. Physical stores cost rent, staff, energy, local stock, replenishment logistics, and to compete against a tech company, you have to accept a period of heavy investment, burning cash now to gain scale later. Netflix, at that stage, was built for that. Blockbuster, with big debt and shareholders demanding results, had very little oxygen to fund the transition calmly, and that was where the final ingredient of corporate tragedy entered: internal war. Activist investors and part of the board wanted to cut costs and protect present profits. Antioco argued that without betting seriously on online, the company would die in the medium term. The dispute went public, turned into a boardroom brawl, and destroyed strategic continuity. Antioco left in 2007, and when a company is in the middle of a change of that magnitude, losing command halfway through is usually fatal. On the flip side, Netflix began to seize the next decade. In 2007, they launched streaming as a complement. At first it was limited, with lower quality and a smaller catalog, almost a bonus for those who already subscribed to DVDs by mail. But the logic was too dangerous to ignore. If the movie can arrive instantly, why would anyone drive to a store, choose a cover, and still risk a charge if they forget to return it? The consumer always chooses convenience when it gets good enough. And here's the part that makes the story even more humiliating for Blockbuster when we look at it today. Netflix stopped being a site mailing DVDs and became one of the biggest media companies on the planet. By early 2026, it is valued at hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap, something around $379 billion, fluctuating with the market. And you know what is most symbolic? When Netflix reaches this size, today valued around the $400 billion mark, it stops being just a platform and becomes a power center in Hollywood. And then the inevitable question arises: will they buy a traditional studio? In recent months, this topic exploded because of Warner Brothers' Discovery. In late 2025, Netflix announced a deal to acquire WBD's studio and streaming assets in a transaction estimated at about $72 billion in equity, but with an important disclaimer: it still depends on regulatory approvals and shareholder votes. And as if that wasn't big enough, Paramount, together with Skydance, jumped in with an even more aggressive, hostile takeover bid, talking about something like $108 billion in total value, trying to cut into the game and turning everything into a public chess match of Hollywood consolidation. In other words, the company that started by sending DVDs in envelopes is now big enough to pull the strings in this kind of corporate war, and that says a lot about the scale of the turnaround. Meanwhile, Blockbuster ran out of room. The end came officially in September 2010 when the company filed for bankruptcy. And here's a detail many people don't know: Blockbuster ended, but the brand didn't disappear from the map. The assets and the Blockbuster brand ended up in the hands of Dish Network after the bankruptcy process, which means the name Blockbuster still has an owner. It just is no longer that empire of stores that dominated your neighborhood. And then the story closes with that irony that stings. Today, there is one last store in Bend, Oregon, surviving much more as a monument to nostalgia than as a model for the future. It became a tourist spot, a t-shirt shop, a living memory of an era when choosing a movie was an outing, not a click. In the end, the big lesson isn't Netflix was better, as if it were just a technological dispute. Blockbuster had the brand, the reach, the money, and the audience in the palm of its hand. It lost because its own model addicted it. It chose the comfort of the present: easy revenue, the physical empire, control through punishment when the customer was already asking for something else: freedom, predictability, and an experience that didn't punish the consumer for being human. In the business world, many people think the risk lies in changing. Blockbuster shows that sometimes the bigger risk is standing still. And now I ask you, do you miss rewinding the tape and picking a movie by looking at the cover? Or do you prefer letting the algorithm decide your next weekend? Drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video here on Money and Magnates.